So, throughout my life as a person with a disability, I've been asked in a number of different contexts to give testimony to different community groups and speeches, and so I've done that pretty much my entire life, and I've seen it as a person with a disability, my responsibility to kind of raise awareness and hopefully raise awareness to the issues that people with disabilities have to deal with. And so I used to go on television. I was Nightline, Action News, and I had 3 documentaries done about me and my service dog. And that helped to raise awareness around the world because they were filmed in Japan, or not filmed here, shown in Japan. And that had a big influence in raising awareness about disability issues, and they started creating handicapped parking in Japan, and they started their own service dog training centers, not completely because of the documentary, but partly that was helpful in that process. And so over the years I got letters from people from all around the world with lots of different disabilities thanking me for whenever there was an article written about me or about my life, or they saw a video about me, that made a difference to people around the world who maybe lived in cultures where the consciousness about disability wasn't as high. And I also, one of the paradoxes about growing up without arms is that it's sort of like being a boy named Sue, and that people think that you're easy pickings, and so you have to learn to stick up for yourself. And so I decided that I may not have the ability to run fast or to reach objects on high shelves, but that if I developed the ability to speak truth to power, then I could make a difference in the lives of others in a meaningful way that's beyond what I could have ever done with arms. And so I worked to strengthen my speaking ability and my debating ability through college and through graduate school, so that I would be able to do that. And in 2007, during the Bush years, there was a real push to deny stem cell research and to not allow that to advance on any front. And so a lot of states and a lot of groups took it upon themselves to begin to craft the legislation that would be needed for the basis for regulations for a field for stem cell research. And so I was asked by a lobbying group in Delaware that was pro-stem cell research, because I had been an undergrad there. I went to the University of Delaware, and I lived in Delaware for 6 years, and had done some advocacy work, and I had met with the governor a number of times about different issues related to disability and public health. And so they decided to have me come and give testimony. Stem Cell Go had recruited me. They're a political action committee in the state of Delaware that was made up of a number of different stakeholders: molecular biologists, people in the field, doctors, and then patients and people with disabilities who would benefit from therapeutic cloning. And so I was recruited by Dr. Vive Griffiths, who's a molecular biologist who was at the University of Delaware at that time. We had been undergrads together. And so she asked me to come because they were going to have a couple people with disabilities who would benefit from stem cell research speak, but they weren't trained speakers. Well, there were other people there who had disabilities that were giving testimony, but they weren't people who had any public speaking training. They didn't have any training, graduate level training in social work or advocacy. They were just people whose lives would be greatly affected if stem cell research were legalized and allowed. And so the idea was to have me be sort of the third person and come in there as somebody with a disability whose life would be changed if stem cell research were to be legalized. But then my remarks were meant to be tighter and just more professional than somebody who has never spoken publicly or practiced giving tight speeches. Now, the actual law that I was testifying for, all it would have done was it would have made cloning yourself illegal in the state of Delaware. And it would have made a $1 million fine for cloning yourself. Now, this may sound kind of weird to be advocating for that kind of law. Well, what I really wanted was to advocate for therapeutic stem cell research and tissue growth and that kind of thing. Is that in order for that to happen, you still need the kind of basis and the regulations and the structure for the field to sit upon. And so there needed to be kind of what's in bounds, what's out of bounds. And so by saying, as a state, that we weren't going to allow a person to clone themselves, that cloning would only be used for tissue, to clone tissues, that was one step in legitimizing it as a field. The piece of legislation that I was advocating for was sort of one of the first planks in a lattice that would support an entire field of stem cell research and therapeutic cloning in the state of Delaware. And part of that is developing the regulations of what can't be done, what's not okay to do. Because in order to be able to define what is okay to do, you have to define what's not okay to do. And the opposition wanted to prevent us from doing that. Although they didn't want people to be able to clone themselves, they fought strenuously for the law to not be passed. The format that they had was that a person from their side spoke and then one person from our side spoke. And they gave us 2.5 minutes for each speaker. And so the first two people with disabilities who gave testimony about how stem cell research would help them were aggressively questioned by the head of the committee, who must have had trial experience as an attorney, because he cross-examined them aggressively to the point of making them both sob. So the first two people with disabilities before me cried and sobbed out of, and they both had severe disabilities and just were vulnerable people and sick people to begin with. And so the fact that the director of the committee treated them that way made me resolve that I was going to do what I could to kind of put him in his place. And so the person that they had speak right before me was a molecular biologist who, from a scientific basis, just said some of the unanswered questions that we had at that time. And in 2007, we didn't know as much about stem cell research as we do now, and so there were more kind of unanswered questions, and she was able to raise, that stem cell research isn't a panacea. But I never said that it was, and my argument didn't depend on that. And so when it was my time to speak, first of all, I decided that I was going to cut my remarks short because I wanted to look that chairman right in the eye and ask him if he had any questions, because I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid of him. and that I could take him on, and that he was messing with somebody that was his own size this time. So when I got up to give my testimony, I looked him right in the eye, and I incorporated what the molecular biologist from the other side had said, and I acknowledged that stem cell research is not a panacea, but it is the best chance that somebody like me ever has of seeing a pain-free day. But then I said that that's not why I'm here. I'm here today to talk about a little girl named Stephanie. And when Stephanie was a toddler, she developed a virus that attacked her little heart, destroying it and requiring her to have a donor heart. And unlike organs that will someday be made with stem cells, donor organs do not grow with the body. And so a child must have a number of transplanted organs before they reach adulthood. And Stephanie hopes to grow up someday and to become a social worker. But she's just gone through her second heart transplant, and the doctors say that before she reaches her 20th birthday, she'll need a third heart transplant, and the chances of surviving the rejection of 3 transplanted organs aren't good. And so we may lose a great social worker who's going to end up helping lots of people in similar circumstances. And last week, George Bush, president, said that we need a culture of life. And I agree with him 100%. We need a culture that values actual life over potential life that will never reach fruition. And so I urge you today to keep Stephanie in your thoughts, to kind of organize my argument so that it would have an emotional toll, so that they would have to look me in my eyes and say no to Stephanie, that they would have to say that by passing that law that they were saying that Stephanie's life wasn't worth as much as an embryo that would never become a human being. And actually when I spoke and when I started speaking about Stephanie, the entire opposition stood up and turned their back to me. They would not look at me the entire time that I gave testimony. And the state representatives who were on my side of the argument afterwards said that they had never seen anything like it, that they had never seen that response from the legislature. The biggest opponent was the Catholic Church. Now, it wasn't that the Catholic Church was pro-cloning themselves. You know, they didn't want people to clone themselves either. But they realized that if the law was passed, then that would kind of be the first plank, and the journey to legalize therapeutic cloning. And so the Catholic Church had gotten the name of every practicing Catholic or any Catholic who had ever gone to a church in Delaware. They got their names and they sent a rose to each legislature, supposedly from each parishioner. So there were roses all over the place. And we had people testify who were Catholics who said, I never gave the church permission to send a rose in my name. You got a rose that has my name, that said that I gave it to you. And they never asked me at all. So they had never actually asked any of Delaware's Catholics. They had just sent these roses on behalf. But it got a lot of the legislatures kind of running scared. Because the law, what the official law would have done would have made cloning yourself illegal, We had Republicans on our side who were moderate Republicans who were for the law. So we had Democrats and moderate Republicans on our side. On the other side, there were staunch Republicans who were more right-wing, and there were also Democrats who were in districts that are heavily Catholic. The part of Delaware that's closest to Maryland is heavily Catholic. And so there were legislatures who were very afraid that if they supported this law, that they would be primaried and they wouldn't win the nomination, let alone re-election. And so when we showed up at the Capitol that day, there was a lot of fear and anxiety in the legislatures whose offices were covered in roses, and by the end, all legislators hated roses. And so then when it came time to give testimony, we were expecting them to show up with maybe 3 to every one of us. And they ended up showing up 10 to every one of us. They came in on buses, and they had the Archbishop of Delaware, and they got some major molecular biologist who was the greatest critic of stem cell research. And they treated it like it was a national issue, and they really had all the guns out because they really wanted to make an example of us so that no other state would even try to even, pick what seemed like a pretty low fruit, making it illegal to clone yourself. So when it came time, they had their speakers, we had our speakers. We had actually coordinated all of our speakers so that we didn't overlap with our points, and we kind of, the points that one person made swung into the next person. Where the other group was much more disorganized, they repeated the same information many times, but they were powerful. There was a guy who stood up who said, stem cell research is the only chance that my son has of reaching adulthood, and it still would be murder, so I can't in good conscience advocate that my son's life be saved over an embryo, an unborn embryo. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to stress that anything in which embryos is destroyed is unacceptable. And so they wanted to try and rewrite the law so that rather than make cloning yourself illegal, it would make in vitro fertilization illegal, because in that process embryos are destroyed. And so I went back to my group and we tried to figure out a way to prevent this from being rewritten. Because the legislatures were terrified of the Catholic Church and the right to life people, they allowed the law to be rewritten so that it would make any destruction of any embryo illegal. So if the law had been passed the way that in the final writing of it, it would have made in vitro fertilization illegal in the state of Delaware. And so my group, my side, had to kill the law to continue to allow in vitro fertilization. So ultimately, it wasn't successful.